Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're headed to Ghana.
Sounds exciting.
It is. We've got this really interesting speech to dig into. A New Dawn for Ghana, the RBG Vision of Prosperity.
Okay, I'm intrigued already.
It's by this aspiring leader, Richmond Bash, and it's not just, typical political stuff.
So it's more than just campaign promises. What's the main idea?
Well, he's laying out this whole vision for Ghana's future, but before we even get to the solutions, he really dives into the challenges the country's facing.
Makes sense. Got to understand the problems before you can fix them.
Right, and he doesn't hold back at all. He talks about poverty, the lack of basic amenities, the divisions that have been holding Ghana back.
That's pretty crucial context then.
Yeah.
I mean, are these problems widely acknowledged, or is he sort of like shaking things up by bringing them up?
He's definitely trying to shake things up. Like right off the bat, he asks, how can we call ourselves independent when so many struggle just to put food on the table?
Whoa, that's a powerful statement.
It's a gut punch, for sure. Makes you confront the reality of the situation.
So he's setting a pretty serious tone from the get-go. Is that intentional?
Totally. He's trying to create this sense of urgency, like things need to change, and this is how we're going to do it.
Okay, so that's where this RBG thing comes in, right?
Exactly. Red for the sacrifices made for freedom, black for unity, and green for the potential of the land.
I see. So it's not just a slogan, it's like a whole framework.
Yeah, and he weaves it throughout the entire speech. It's kind of clever how he connects each color to specific challenges and solutions.
Could you give an example?
Sure, like when he talks about black representing unity, he's directly addressing those ethnic and political divisions that have been plaguing Ghana for decades.
Ah, right. So the colors become a way to, like, visualize his points.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's get into the meat of his vision, which is built on 3 pillars: unity, basic amenities, and economic empowerment.
3 pillars. Got it. And each one's kind of a big deal.
Oh yeah, he goes way beyond the usual vague political promises.
That's refreshing. So where does he start?
Well, he starts with unity because he argues that it's the foundation for everything else.
That's an interesting approach.
Mm-hmm.
So he's basically saying that Ghana can't move forward if it's constantly being torn apart internally.
Precisely. He acknowledges the deep divisions in Ghanaian society and calls for a more inclusive, unified approach to governing.
That's a noble goal, for sure. But is it realistic? I mean, Ghana's history is full of, well, tensions, right?
Right. There's a long history of ethnic tensions and political rivalries. So I'm curious, has there ever been a real push for this kind of unity before?
There have been attempts, yeah, but they've usually been short-lived or met with resistance from those in power.
So what makes this time different? Why does he think it'll work now?
Well, one thing that's different about Bash's approach is that he's making unity the central theme. It's not just a side note. It's like the foundation of his whole vision.
Okay, but can one leader really overcome those kinds of deep-rooted divisions, especially when it comes to, like, resources and political representation?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we'll have to explore that further as we dig into his policy proposals.
Fair enough. But for now, it's at least interesting that he's acknowledging this big issue that a lot of politicians just ignore.
Definitely. So what's the second pillar?
Basic amenities. He specifically mentions clean water, affordable health care, and quality education for all Ghanaians.
Okay, that's pretty standard, I guess, for political platforms. What makes his approach stand out?
He's not framing these as aspirations, but as fundamental rights.
Ah, so he's raising the stakes. These aren't just nice-to-haves, they're essentials.
Exactly, and that's a big shift from how a lot of governments view these issues.
Well, can he actually pull it off? I mean, Ghana's resources are limited. How do you even begin to tackle something as massive as, say, a lack of clean water for a huge part of the population?
Well, that's where the specifics come in. He talks about investing in infrastructure, empowering local communities, and holding officials accountable.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about changing the way things are done.
Right, it's a fundamental shift in priorities.
Which makes his vision really bold, but also incredibly challenging. I mean, promising clean water and healthcare is one thing, but actually delivering on those promises in a sustainable and equitable way, that's a whole other ballgame.
Totally. So we've got unity as the foundation, basic amenities as the essential building blocks. But then there's this whole economic empowerment piece, which feels like where his vision really gets exciting.
Yeah, this is where he gets into the specifics of how he plans to transform Ghana's economy. And that's where things get really interesting. He's setting some ambitious goals, to say the least. Ambitious in what way? What's he aiming for?
He talks about making Ghana the breadbasket of Africa.
Whoa, that's a big goal.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing, but is that even, like, remotely realistic?
It's definitely bold, and
Hmm.
it raises a lot of questions. I mean, can Ghana actually compete with places like South Africa and Kenya? They're already major players in agriculture.
Right, and it's not just about competition. What about the resources needed to pull this off? We're talking about a massive investment in infrastructure, technology, training for farmers.
Yeah, you need the whole ecosystem in place, not just fertile land. Irrigation systems, storage facilities, transportation networks, access to global markets.
Exactly. And then there's the question of the impact on small-scale farmers, the ones who are already struggling.
Yeah, will they benefit from this focus on agriculture, or will they get pushed out by big agribusinesses?
That's a crucial point. Bash talks about empowering smallholder farmers, but how exactly will that work? Will there be programs to ensure they have access to land, credit, markets?
And will they be able to compete fairly with larger producers? That's the part that always worries me.
I get it. It's easy to throw around slogans about supporting small farmers, but actually doing it in a way that benefits them and doesn't just lead to more consolidation of land and resources, that's a whole different challenge.
It's a challenge a lot of countries have struggled with. We've seen those well-intentioned development programs backfire and actually end up displacing small farmers.
Yeah, you have to look beyond the rhetoric and see what concrete measures are being proposed.
So lots of potential with this breadbasket idea, but also a lot of potential pitfalls. What are some of the other key things in his economic plan?
Well, alongside agriculture, he talks about boosting small businesses and embracing technology as drivers of economic growth.
Okay, makes sense. SMEs are often seen as the backbone of any economy, but they usually face a lot of hurdles, right? Like getting access to capital and competing with larger companies.
Exactly.
Mm.
And he addresses those challenges head on. He talks about creating a more favorable regulatory environment, reducing bureaucracy, offering tax incentives for small businesses.
That's a good start. But what about, the digital divide? I mean, it's one thing to talk about creating a tech hub, but if a big chunk of the population doesn't even have internet access.
You're hitting on a key point. He actually does talk about that. Investing in digital infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, making sure everyone has the skills to participate in the digital economy.
So he's acknowledging that technology is not just a sector in itself, but a tool for growth across all sectors.
Precisely. And that's smart, given that Africa has the youngest population in the world and this rapidly expanding tech scene.
It's like he understands that to compete globally, Ghana needs to embrace innovation and those young entrepreneurs.
Yeah, he's tapping into that energy.
Okay, so we've got agriculture, small businesses, technology. But there's this other layer to his economic vision that I found fascinating. This idea of a united Africa and Ghana's role in driving continental prosperity.
Ah, yes. That's a recurring theme in his speech. And it ties directly to his vision for Ghana's economic transformation. He's basically arguing that Ghana can't succeed in isolation.
Right. It has to be part of a bigger movement towards integration and cooperation. I remember that quote he uses from Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president. Something about Ghana's independence being meaningless unless it's linked to the total liberation of Africa. Powerful stuff, but what does that actually mean for Ghana's economic future?
It means that Bash sees Ghana's success as intertwined with the success of the whole continent, breaking down trade barriers, promoting investment, working together to address issues like climate change and poverty. It's all connected.
So it's not just about Ghana being the breadbasket of Africa. It's about using that strength to lift up other African nations and create a more prosperous continent.
That's the ideal he's presenting, and it's an idea that has resonated with a lot of people. But, and there's always a but, it also faces major challenges.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Africa's incredibly diverse, complex history, different political and economic systems. How does he plan to deal with all that and make this Pan-African dream a reality?
Well, he talks about strengthening regional partnerships, engaging with the African Union, promoting those people-to-people exchanges to build understanding.
So building relationships on multiple levels.
Exactly. And he also stresses the importance of good governance, transparency, accountability. All those things are essential for building trust and attracting investment.
Sounds like he's trying to balance this grand vision with a realistic understanding of the challenges involved. But the question that keeps coming back to me is it all just talk? Or can he actually make it happen?
That's the million-seedy question.
Yeah.
And it's one we need to keep asking as we dig deeper into his policy proposals and the potential obstacles he'll face.
Okay, so we've got the big picture of his vision for Ghana: unity, basic amenities, economic empowerment, the Pan-African element. Now I want to get into the details. What are some of the specific things he's actually proposing to do to make all of this a reality? Let's start with that unity pillar. He said over and over that everything else depends on a more unified Ghana. So how does he actually plan to bridge those divisions, the ones that have been around for so long?
Well, one of the big things he keeps coming back to is constitutional reform.
Interesting. What's wrong with the current constitution?
He argues that it gives too much power to the executive branch and doesn't really represent the diversity of Ghanaian society.
Okay, so what does he want to do about it?
He proposes a more decentralized system, more regional autonomy, stronger checks and balances.
To prevent any one group from dominating, right?
Exactly. He's talked about establishing a Senate to represent different regions and ethnic groups, and giving more power to those local councils to make decisions about things that affect their communities directly.
Ah, so bringing the decision-making closer to the people.
Right. He also proposes an independent electoral commission to make sure elections are free and fair, which has been a bit of a sticking point in the past.
For sure. So he's not just talking about unity in the abstract. He's actually putting forward specific ways to address the power imbalances and lack of representation that have caused these divisions.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that these ideas didn't just come out of nowhere. There's been a lot of debate and activism in Ghana about constitutional reform and decentralization. Bash is drawing on those movements and giving them a voice in his vision.
It's smart politically, but it also shows that he's listening to what people have been saying for years. Okay, let's move on to basic amenities, starting with healthcare. He promised affordable, quality healthcare for all Ghanaians. That's a huge undertaking. How's he going to pull that off?
Well, he talks about a multi-pronged approach: expanding primary care, investing in hospitals and equipment, training more doctors and nurses.
That all makes sense, but it also sounds incredibly expensive.
He also mentions tackling the high cost of medications, which is a big barrier for a lot of people.
Right, meds can be outrageously expensive, so how's he going to pay for all this?
He's floated the idea of increasing government spending, attracting foreign investment, and exploring some creative financing models like health insurance schemes specifically for low-income communities.
Health insurance, that's an interesting idea. Has that ever been tried in Ghana before?
There have been some small-scale programs, but never anything nationwide. It's tough, finding that balance between making it affordable for people and keeping the whole system sustainable.
And you have to make sure everyone has access, not just those in cities or those who can afford those higher premiums. It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It definitely won't be easy, but a lot of countries have done it successfully. If Ghana can figure out a model that works for them, it can make a huge difference for people's health and well-being.
Absolutely. Okay, what about education? He's called for quality education for everyone, and I remember him specifically mentioning empowering teachers. What does that actually involve?
Well, he's proposed raising teacher salaries, offering better training and professional development, and making class sizes smaller so teachers can give more individual attention to each student. He also wants to revamp the curriculum, make it more relevant to today's economy.
Sounds good on paper, but again, it comes down to resources and implementation. How do you make sure these changes actually reach every school, not just the fancy ones in the cities?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? He's talked about boosting the education budget, attracting private investment, and working with international organizations to help with things like teacher training. But in the end, it'll depend on political will and making sure those resources are managed well.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it? All right, let's shift gears and talk about his economic plans, starting with that vision of Ghana as the breadbasket of Africa. It's ambitious, to say the least, and probably the most controversial part of his whole agenda.
Definitely a bold goal, and it stirred up a lot of debate. Some experts think Ghana could really become a big agricultural exporter. They point to the fertile land, the climate, the relatively young population. But others are more skeptical. They say it's going to be tough to compete with those established producers, to attract enough investment, and to make sure small-scale farmers don't get left behind.
So high risk, high reward. What are some of the concrete steps he's outlined to reach this goal?
Well, for starters, he wants to invest in irrigation, storage facilities, and transportation networks. That's all about improving efficiency and cutting down on those post-harvest losses. He's also talked about promoting value-added processing, moving beyond just exporting raw materials.
Makes sense. Get more of the profits, right? But what about access to markets? Is he going to try and negotiate new trade deals so Ghanaian products can compete globally?
He's open to new trade partnerships, both within Africa and internationally. But he's also stressed the importance of meeting those global quality standards and promoting Ghanaian products as ethical and sustainable.
That's smart. People care more and more about where their food comes from, how it impacts the environment and local communities.
Exactly. And Ghana could really become a leader in sustainable agriculture. That would give them a real advantage in the global market.
All right, last piece of the puzzle, small businesses. We know he sees them as essential for economic growth, but how's he going to support them?
He's talked about simplifying the process of registering a business, giving tax breaks and other incentives to SMEs, and setting up a special fund to help them access capital. He also wants to improve access to training and mentorship programs to help entrepreneurs grow their businesses.
All good ideas. But, as always, the question is, how do you make sure these programs actually work? How do you cut through the corruption and bureaucracy that have messed things up in the past?
Well, he's made transparency and accountability a big part of his message. He's promised a level playing field for everyone, regardless of their connections. And he's talked about using technology to make it easier for people to get information about those programs and see how they're doing.
I like that. It shows he's thinking about the whole system, not just the policies themselves.
Yeah, he seems to understand that real change takes more than just good ideas. You need good governance, you need transparency, and you need to empower people at every level.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot today. We've gone deep into Richmond Bash's vision for Ghana, from his focus on unity and constitutional reform to his plans for basic amenities and economic empowerment. It's definitely a bold agenda, and there's no guarantee it'll all work out.
Right, there are definitely challenges ahead. But his vision is exciting. It's grounded in a deep understanding of Ghana's past, but it's also full of hope for the future. And not just for Ghana, but for all of Africa.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into Ghanaian politics. It's a complex and fascinating topic, and we've only scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn. Dig deeper into the things that interested you, seek out different viewpoints, and keep those conversations going.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into something that matters.